The rain fell in sheets across the Luzon Plains that morning of January 27, 1945. Mud, thick as mortar, clung to the treads of the approaching Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank as it churned through the flooded rice paddies north of Manila. Inside the cramped steel hull, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his eye against the vision slit, watching the rain cascade down the narrow opening. The smell of oil and sweat and hot metal filled the compartment where 4 men sat wedged against ammunition racks and engine housing. Through the mechanical roar, Yamamoto could hear his own breathing, sharp and shallow. Ahead, somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, American forces had established positions along the highway. The Emperor's standing orders were absolute: hold the line, delay the enemy advance, sacrifice everything. Yamamoto touched the thin steel wall beside him, barely thicker than a man's thumb. 14 millimeters. He had measured it himself with calipers back at the depot. 14 millimeters between him and whatever the Americans would throw at them. The Type 95 Hago light tank had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army when it first rolled off assembly lines in 1936. At that time, it represented the cutting edge of Japanese armored doctrine, a philosophy born not from the vast industrial plains of the Ruhr or Detroit, but from the rocky hills of Manchuria and the humid jungles of southern China. The tank weighed 7.5 tons, could achieve speeds of 28 miles per hour on flat ground, and mounted a 37mm main gun in its small turret. For the campaigns it was designed to fight, colonial policing actions against poorly equipped Chinese forces, rapid advances through terrain where heavier tanks would founder, the Hago had been adequate. Some might even say successful. It had crushed resistance in Manchukuo. It had supported infantry assaults during the brutal campaigns along the Yangtze River. In those early victories, when Japan seemed ascendant and destiny itself appeared to march beneath the rising sun, the Hago had been enough.
But January 1945 was not 1936. The war had moved on, grown monstrous and industrial in ways that designers at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries could never have imagined. The Americans who now poured ashore at Lingayen Gulf came equipped with weapons forged in factories that operated on scales beyond Japanese comprehension. Where Japanese industry struggled to produce thousands of tanks throughout the entire war, American plants scamped out thousands per month. Where Japanese engineers worked with steel allotments that required them to compromise on every armor plate, American metallurgians had access to seemingly endless supplies of high-grade steel, chrome, and molybdenum. The technological and industrial gap had always existed. But in those early months after Pearl Harbor, when victory followed victory, it had seemed irrelevant. Now, as the empire contracted and burned, that gap had become a chasm, and men like Sergeant Yamamoto were ordered to bridge it with their bodies.
The American infantry positions along Highway 3 had been established 2 days earlier. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, crouched in a foxhole reinforced with sandbags and palm logs, watching the northern approach through the rain. He had been issued the new M1 Garand rifle 15 months earlier, during training at Camp Roberts in California. The weapon still amazed him. 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ammunition in a clip. Semi-automatic fire. Effective range of 500 yards. Chin had grown up watching his father work 16-hour days in a laundry, had seen his mother's hands crack and bleed from lye soap, had known poverty intimate as a second skin. Then the Army had handed him this rifle, given him hot meals 3 times a day, new boots when his old ones wore out, medical care, dental care, cigarettes, and pay that he sent home in money orders every month. The abundance had shocked him initially. Now it simply seemed normal, the way America waged war. Beside Chen's foxhole, Corporal James Morrison from Birmingham, Alabama, checked his Browning automatic rifle for the 3rd time that morning. The BAR weighed 19 pounds fully loaded and could fire up to 650 rounds per minute. Morrison had 20 magazines stacked in his foxhole, 400 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, each bullet capable of penetrating half an inch of steel at close range. He also carried 6 Mark II fragmentation grenades, a .45 caliber M111 pistol as a sidearm, a combat knife, and enough C rations to last 4 days. The weight of his equipment would have crushed the Japanese infantrymen, whose entire combat load often consisted of a bolt-action area soccer rifle, 60 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and a rice ball wrapped in bamboo leaf. Morrison did not think about these disparities. He simply knew that when he pulled the trigger, the BAR would fire, that when he needed more ammunition, someone would bring it forward, that if he got wounded, a medic would reach him quickly and morphine would dull the pain. These certainties of supply, of support, of industrial backing formed the invisible infrastructure of American military power. The Hago emerged from the rain like a gray ghost, its low profile making it difficult to spot initially against the flooded paddies. Yamamoto had ordered his driver to advance slowly, minimizing engine noise, hoping to close the distance before the Americans opened fire. It was a futile hope. The sound of tank treads, even moving slowly through mud, carried across flat ground. Chen saw it first, a darker shape moving through the gray curtain of rain, and shouted a warning. Morrison swung the BAR toward the target, resting the bipod on the sandbag lip of his foxhole. For a moment he hesitated. The thing approaching looked so small, so fragile compared to the Sherman tanks he had seen rumbling through the beachhead. It seemed almost toy-like, a child's idea of a tank rendered in thin steel. Then, training took over. He squeezed the trigger.
The sound of the BAR in full automatic fire is difficult to describe to those who have never heard it. It lacks the sharp crack of a rifle or the thunderous boom of artillery. Instead, it produces a rapid hammering roar, each shot blending into the next to create a sustained mechanical violence. Morrison fired a full 20-round magazine into the approaching Hago, the weapon bucking against his shoulder, hot brass cartridges ejecting in a glittering arc to his right. At a range of less than 200 yards, the armor-piercing rounds from this BAR struck the Hago's front glasses plate like hammers striking a tin can. The 14mm armor plate, designed to stop rifle rounds and shell fragments, had no chance against concentrated automatic fire from a weapon firing .30-06 AP ammunition. The first round sparked off the armor, leaving bright gouges in the steel. The next rounds punched through.
Chen watched the tank shudder to a halt, smoke pouring from multiple puncture wounds in its armor. He had fired perhaps 30 rounds from his Garand, aiming for the vision slits and any weak points he could identify. Now the turret hatch popped open, and a figure emerged, moving with the desperate speed of a man escaping a burning building. Chen did not want to shoot. The figure was clearly wounded, one arm hanging useless, uniform dark with blood. But the figure was also reaching for something at his belt, a pistol, perhaps, or a grenade, and Chen's training overrode his hesitation. He fired twice. The figure on the tank turret jerked, slumped, and slid down the wet steel to disappear into the mud below. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. One Japanese tank immobilized and destroyed by small arms fire alone. No anti-tank weapons had been necessary. No bazooka rounds. No 37mm anti-tank guns. No artillery support. Just rifles and automatic weapons firing standard infantry ammunition. Morrison ejected his spent magazine and loaded a fresh one, more from habit than need. The tank sat silent now, smoke still rising from its perforated hull, mixing with the rain. He felt no triumph, only a kind of grim satisfaction that his weapon had functioned as designed, that the training had proved accurate. The Hago burned in the rain, a small pyre marking the spot where Japanese armored doctrine had collided with American industrial reality.
The scene or variations of it repeated itself across the Pacific Theater throughout 1944 and 1945, with a frequency that shocked even American commanders who thought they understood Japanese weakness. Official U.S. Army reports from the Philippines campaign documented numerous instances of light Japanese tanks being knocked out by 50 caliber machine gun fire, BAR fire, and even concentrated rifle fire from standard M1 Garons. The nickname paper tank emerged not from propaganda, but from frontline infantry who genuinely could not believe that any nation would send men into battle in vehicles so poorly protected. Intelligence analysts examining captured Hago tanks measured the armor thickness with mounting disbelief: 14 millimeters on the front glacis, 12 millimeters on the sides, 6 millimeters on the deck. For context, the American M4 Sherman tank, which the U.S. Army itself considered inadequately armored, mounted 50 millimeters of frontal armor, nearly 4 times as thick. German Panzer IV tanks, the workhorse of Wehrmacht armored divisions, carried 80 millimeters of frontal armor. Against such vehicles, infantry small arms were effectively useless. Against the Hago, they were devastating.
The Japanese tank crews knew this. They were not fools or fanatics blind to reality. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly how inadequate their equipment had become. Lieutenant Masao Kobayashi, a tank platoon commander who survived the Philippines campaign only to die on Okinawa 3 months later, left a diary that was recovered after the war. His entries from January 1945 make for difficult reading. "We are sent forward in these steel coffins," he wrote on January 15, "knowing they will be our graves. The Americans do not even need their tank destroyers to kill us. Their infantry laughs as we approach. We hear them laughing sometimes before the shooting starts. I do not blame them. If I saw our tanks from the outside, I would laugh too." 3 days later, "Lost 2 tanks today to machine gun fire. Machine gun fire! We could not even get close enough to use our main guns. What do they expect us to do? We train a samurai. We are told we fight with the spirit of warriors. But spirit cannot stop bullets. Spirit cannot make steel thicker. Spirit cannot—" The entry ended there, unfinished.
But we must resist the temptation to see this purely as a story of Japanese failure. That would be too simple, too convenient. The truth is more complex and more troubling. The Hago light tank was not poorly designed for what it was meant to do. In 1936, in 1937, even in 1941, it had been adequate for the mission parameters Japanese military doctrine required. The fundamental problem was that Japanese doctrine had been crafted in isolation, shaped by limited resources and regional conflicts against opponents who lacked modern weapons. Japan had entered the age of mechanized warfare as a poor nation with imperial ambitions, and its armored forces reflected that poverty. The entire Japanese tank production for the war years, 1941 to 1945, totaled approximately 6,000 vehicles of all types. The Soviet Union produced 105,000 tanks in the same period. The United States produced 88,000. Germany produced 67,000. Even Britain, fighting for survival and dependent on American industrial support, produced 27,000. Japan's total tank production represented less than 7% of American output. This was not a failure of engineering or courage. It was mathematics, cold and absolute.
American soldiers encountering Japanese tanks often expressed pity mixed with contempt, a dangerous combination that bred overconfidence. But some, the thoughtful ones, recognized what those thin steel shells actually represented. Chaplain Francis Duffy, serving with the 1st Cavalry Division in the Philippines, wrote to his sister in March 1945, "I performed services today over a destroyed Japanese tank. 4 men had been inside. What we recovered barely filled 1 coffin. The tank itself looked like it had been attacked by a giant with a can opener. I found myself wondering about the men who built this thing, who sent other men to fight in it. What desperation drives a nation to field weapons it knows are inadequate? What does it mean that we face enemies so poorly equipped and yet the war continues? Our boys joke about paper tanks, but I think of paper as something fragile we use to write letters home, to record thoughts, to preserve memory. These tanks are coffins made of national desperation, and the men inside them loved their families just as our boys love theirs. The symbolic weight of the Hago's inadequacy extended beyond the tactical level. For Japanese soldiers, the tank came to represent the widening gap between propaganda and reality, between what they had been told about Japanese technical prowess and what they experienced in battle. The military education system in pre-war Japan had emphasized spiritual superiority, the idea that Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, could overcome material disadvantages. Officers were taught that morale, training, and willingness to sacrifice would compensate for any technological shortcomings. This philosophy had not been entirely wrong in earlier conflicts. Japanese forces had defeated larger Russian armies in 1905 through superior tactics and fighting spirit. Infantry attacks had broken Chinese lines throughout the 1930s despite equipment disadvantages. But the Pacific War operated on a different scale, against enemies who matched Japanese courage with their own determination and backed it with crushing material superiority. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, a tank crewman captured on Luzon in February 1945, spoke to American interrogators with a candor that surprised them. The interview transcripts, declassified in 1975, record his response when asked why Japanese tanks continued to engage American forces despite obvious inferiority. "What choice did we have? We were soldiers. We followed orders. But more than that, we wanted to believe that our training, our spirit, our willingness to die would somehow matter. We had been told all our lives that these things made us special, made us strong."
To accept that they did not matter, that only steel thickness and factory production mattered, was to accept that everything we had been taught was a lie. So we climbed into our tanks each morning and told ourselves that today would be different, that today our skill would overcome their mettle. We told ourselves this even as we watched our friends burn. When asked if he felt betrayed by his commanders, Nakamura paused for a long time before answering. Betrayed? No, we were all trapped in the same story, commanders and common soldiers alike. We were trapped by our own history, by the smallness of our islands, by decisions made long before we were born. The Americans crushed us because they had more of everything. More steel, more bullets, more food, more gasoline, more men. You cannot fight arithmetic with spirit. But we had to try, because the alternative was to surrender everything we believed about ourselves. The asymmetry in firepower between American and Japanese forces manifested in countless small details that, accumulated, revealed the fundamental nature of American military power. Consider the ammunition situation. A single American infantry company attacking a fortified position in 1945 would typically expend more ammunition in one day than a Japanese infantry battalion had in its entire inventory. American squad leaders never worried about conserving ammunition. The doctrine was to achieve overwhelming fire superiority, to make the enemy unable to raise their heads, to break their will through sheer volume of fire. If a position needed to be suppressed, you poured hundreds of rounds into it. If a bunker needed to be destroyed, you called for artillery, and within minutes, high-explosive shells would be falling. Japanese commanders, by contrast, constantly worried about ammunition. Soldiers were told to make every shot count, to aim carefully, to fire only when certain of hitting. This was presented as discipline and skill, but it was really just scarcity given a virtuous name. The same pattern extended to every aspect of military supply. American soldiers ate hot meals from mobile kitchens whenever possible, supplemented by sea rations that included canned meat, crackers, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee, and even toilet paper. Japanese soldiers subsisted on rice when they could get it, and when they couldn't, they foraged, they starved. American casualties received morphine for pain, plasma for blood loss, sulfa drugs for infection, and rapid evacuation to field hospitals equipped with surgical teams and X-ray machines. Japanese casualties received a bandage if they were lucky, a bullet if they were not, and orders to die honorably rather than burden their unit. American tanks and trucks that broke down were repaired or replaced from a seemingly endless supply chain. Japanese vehicles that broke down were often abandoned because spare parts did not exist. This was not a war. It was a mismatch of such fundamental proportions that the only mystery was why it took so long to conclude. Yet the Hago continued to see combat long after its obsolescence had become undeniable. On Saipan in June 1944, Japanese tank units launched a desperate counterattack against American positions, knowing it was suicidal, doing it anyway because orders demanded it and honor required it. American accounts describe the attack with a mixture of awe and horror. Dozens of light tanks charging across open ground, backlit by burning buildings, while American anti-tank guns and bazookas cut them down like wheat before a scythe. Not a single Japanese tank reached American lines. Not one. The attack achieved nothing except to add more names to the casualty lists, more families receiving notices that began, "Deeply regret to inform you." But to the Japanese commanders who ordered it, the attack had meaning beyond its tactical futility. It was a demonstration that they had not surrendered, that they still chose action over passive defeat, that they retained agency even in the face of certain death. This psychology, this need to demonstrate will in the absence of capability, defined Japanese military action in the war's final year. The American soldiers who destroyed these tanks rarely thought about such things in the moment. They were focused on survival, on completing their mission, on protecting the men beside them. But afterward, in quiet moments, some wrestled with what they had witnessed. Technical Sergeant Paul Zimmerman, a tank commander with the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima, described encountering a destroyed Hago in a letter home. The Jap tank was on its side in a shell crater, turret blown off, burned black. I climbed down to look inside, though the smell told me I shouldn't. There was a photograph pinned to the interior wall, survived somehow despite the fire. 3 people in the photograph, a man in uniform, young, smiling, a woman in a kimono, and a little boy, maybe 5 years old. They were standing in front of a house with a small garden. Just a family picture like we all carry. The man in the photograph was probably the tank commander, and he was probably still in that tank, reduced to ash and bone fragments. I stood there thinking about that little boy who would grow up without a father, and whose father had died inside a machine that couldn't protect him, sent to fight a battle he couldn't win. What's the point, Ma? What's the point of any of it? The technical specifications tell part of the story, but only part. The Hago weighed 7.4 tons and could be penetrated by .50 caliber machine gun fire at close range. The American M4 Sherman weighed 30 tons and required dedicated anti-tank weapons to destroy. But these numbers, stark as they are, do not capture the human dimension. The knowledge, shared by everyone who climbed into a Hago, that the vehicle offered only the illusion of protection. It was armor in name only, a steel shell thin enough to be shredded by bullets meant for infantry. The psychological impact of going into combat in such a vehicle cannot be overstated. Imagine knowing, with absolute certainty, that your armor will not stop enemy fire. Imagine climbing into that steel coffin anyway, because duty demands it, and the alternative is dishonor. Imagine listening to bullets strike your tank, hearing them punch through, waiting for the one that finds you. This was the daily reality for Japanese tank crews in 1944 and 1945. American forces, meanwhile, operated under different psychological conditions. They knew their equipment was superior. They knew they had the support of the world's most powerful industrial economy. They knew that if they were wounded, they would receive the best medical care available anywhere on Earth. They knew that behind the front lines, vast supply networks ensured they would never lack for food, ammunition, or fuel. This knowledge, this certainty of material backing, affected combat effectiveness in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Soldiers fight better when they believe in their equipment, when they trust that the system supporting them will not fail, when they know their sacrifices occur within a framework that values their lives and provides the tools necessary for survival. American forces had this confidence. Japanese forces increasingly did not.
The symbolic resonance of the paper tank extended into American popular consciousness during and after the war. Magazine articles and newsreels portrayed Japanese tanks as laughable, evidence of Japanese technical backwardness, and proof of inevitable American victory. "Even their tanks are made of paper," proclaimed one newsreel narrator, as footage showed a destroyed Ha-Go being examined by grinning American soldiers. This narrative served important propaganda purposes, reinforcing the message that American industrial might would overwhelm any enemy. But it also obscured important truths. Japanese engineers and workers were not incompetent. They were simply trying to build modern military equipment with a resource base 1/10 the size of America's, using an industrial infrastructure that had started decades behind. They were trying to run an industrial-age war with a pre-industrial economy. The miracle is not that they failed, but that they managed to sustain the effort as long as they did. Consider what Japan actually managed to accomplish industrially during the war. Despite having a steel production capacity roughly 7% of America's, despite losing access to imported raw materials, despite facing systematic bombing of industrial centers from 1944 onward, Japan continued producing aircraft, warships, ammunition, and yes, tanks until the very end of the war. The Ha-Go remained in production through 1943, with later models incorporating slightly thicker armor after early combat experience revealed the vehicle's extreme vulnerability. These upgrades raised frontal armor to 16 millimeters, an improvement that made essentially no difference against American weapons, but demonstrated that Japanese engineers understood the problem and worked to address it within impossible constraints. They could not create steel where none existed. They could not build thicker armor without making the tank heavier, and they could not make it heavier without more powerful engines they did not have the industrial capacity to produce in sufficient quantities. Every design decision represented a compromise, every compromise a sacrifice, every sacrifice an acknowledgement of limits that American designers never had to consider. The end came for the Ha-Go not in a single dramatic moment, but through gradual attrition and irrelevance. By early 1945, so few remained operational that they had ceased to matter militarily. The last significant use of Japanese light tanks in combat occurred during the defense of Manila in February 1945, when a handful of Ha-Go and Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks attempted to contest the American advance through the city. They were destroyed within hours, most without firing a shot, victims of American airstrikes and artillery fire. A few Ha-Go survived to see action on Okinawa in April 1945, but they were dispersed in penny packets, dug in as pillboxes rather than used as mobile fighting vehicles. The transformation from tank to static fortification represented the final indignity, the acknowledgement that the vehicle had no future as a weapon of maneuver. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, American occupation forces found Ha-Go tanks scattered across Japan itself, hidden in warehouses, dug into defensive positions along beaches, prepared for the invasion that never came. They were the last reserves, held back for the final battle. Inspecting them, American ordnance officers expressed private relief that the invasion had not been necessary. Not because the Ha-Go posed any threat, they did not, but because the men inside them would have fought with the same desperate courage that had characterized Japanese resistance throughout the war, and thousands more would have died in machines that could not protect them.
After the war, several Ha-Go tanks were brought to the United States for technical evaluation and display. One resides today at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Maryland. It sits behind velvet ropes, its armor pocked with holes from American bullets, its thin steel plates buckled and torn. Schoolchildren walk past it on field trips, pausing briefly to read the placard before moving on to more impressive vehicles. The Sherman tanks command more attention. They are larger, more imposing, more obviously powerful. The Ha-Go is easy to overlook, this small, damaged relic from a war 3/4 of a century past. But sometimes, if you watch long enough, you will see a visitor pause longer than the others, a veteran perhaps, or a student of history, someone who understands what the thin armor represents. They will reach out, almost involuntarily, and touch the steel, fingers tracing the ragged holes where bullets punch through. In that moment, perhaps they glimpse what the young men inside experienced, the terrible intimacy of combat in a vehicle that offered no real protection, the courage it required to face battle anyway, the human cost of industrial mismatch. The legacy of the Heigo extends beyond its combat record. It became a symbol of the fundamental impossibility of Japan's position in the Pacific War. Japan had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, 50 times its oil production, and vast geographic resources that made it essentially invulnerable to Japanese attack. Japanese leaders had known these facts before Pearl Harbor. They had attacked anyway, hoping that American will would break before Japanese resources were exhausted, gambling on a negotiated peace that would leave Japan's empire intact. The gamble had failed catastrophically, and the Heigo's inadequacy was one small marker of that failure, a visible, tangible reminder that courage and skill and spirit cannot overcome arithmetic, that wars between industrial nations are ultimately decided in factories and oil fields and steel mills, not on battlefields. But to reduce the Heigo solely to a symbol of defeat misses something essential about the men who crewed it. They were not fools. They were soldiers, doing their duty as they understood it, serving a cause they believed in even when that cause was lost. Sergeant Yamamoto, dying in the mud of a Luzon rice paddy, did not die for a paper tank. He died for Japan, for the emperor, for his family's honor, for reasons that seemed sufficient in the moment, even if history would later judge them harshly. His death was not more meaningful or less meaningful than the death of an American soldier, was not more heroic or less heroic. It was simply a death, one of millions, rendered necessary by decisions made in capitals far from the battlefield, by men who would never climb into a tank or charge through mud under fire. The rain continued falling that morning in January 1945, washing blood and oil into the churned earth, diluting and dispersing until no trace remained. The Heigo sat silent, smoke dissipating, becoming just another piece of wreckage in a landscape already cluttered with the debris of war. American soldiers moved forward past it, barely glancing at the small destroyed tank, already focused on the next objective, the next fight, the slow, terrible march toward Tokyo. The war ground on, as wars do, consuming lives and metal and meaning, transforming men into corpses and machines into scrap. Until finally, in August, the atomic fire bloomed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the emperor's voice crackled over radios across Japan, speaking words no emperor had spoken before: acceptance of defeat, order to surrender, end of the war.
In the years that followed, historians would analyze the Pacific War through countless lenses: strategic, tactical, political, economic, moral. They would debate Truman's decision to use atomic weapons, would argue about whether Japan would have surrendered without the bombs, would measure victory and defeat in tonnages and casualty figures and territorial changes. These are important discussions, necessary for understanding the scope and meaning of the conflict, but they sometimes lose sight of the granular human reality, the individual moments where theory met practice, and men discovered what their nations had prepared them to face. The Hago versus American infantry firepower was one such moment, repeated hundreds of times across the Pacific, a small encounter that revealed large truths about industrial war, national power, and the limits of courage. What does it mean that American soldiers could destroy enemy tanks with rifles? What does it say about the nature of war in the 20th century that such a mismatch was possible? Perhaps it tells us that modern warfare had become too expensive, too industrial, too dependent on resources for any but the wealthiest nations to wage successfully. Perhaps it tells us that once the industrial gap between opponents grows large enough, no amount of training or courage or tactical skill can compensate. Perhaps it tells us that we had entered an age where wars would be won not by the side with better soldiers, but by the side with better factories. These are uncomfortable conclusions, because they suggest that individual human agency matters less than systemic factors beyond any soldier's control, that the brave and the cowardly die equally when the industrial calculus does not favor their nation. But I think there is another lesson, less obvious, but more important. The men who climbed into Hago tanks knowing they were inadequate, who faced American firepower knowing it would likely kill them, who fought anyway because duty demanded it. They remind us that human beings retain the capacity for choice even in the most constrained circumstances. They could have refused. Some did. Desertion, though rare in the Japanese military, was not unknown. They could have surrendered. Many did, especially in the war's final months when the outcome was no longer in doubt. But most chose to fight, not because they were mindless fanatics or because they had been brainwashed by propaganda, but because they had made a calculation about honor, duty, and meaning that led them to accept death rather than dishonor. We can disagree with their choice. We can judge the cause they fought for as unjust, the war they waged as aggressive and brutal, but we cannot deny that they faced their circumstances with a courage that transcends political judgment. Similarly, the American soldiers who destroyed those tanks were not simply operating as cogs in an industrial machine. Yes, they had better equipment. Yes, they had superior logistics. Yes, they represented a nation with vastly greater resources. But they were also individual men who faced fear, who acted with courage, who supported one another in combat, who mourned their dead and honored their sacrifices. The industrial advantage did not fight the war. Men fought the war, men who happened to have an industrial advantage. That distinction matters. It means that even in mechanized warfare, even in conflicts decided ultimately by steel production and oil output, human factors retain their importance. Leadership matters, training matters, morale matters. These things do not overcome material disadvantage, but they shape how material advantage is employed, and they determine whether victory, once achieved, will be used wisely or squandered.
The Hago sits in its museum today, a relic preserved behind glass, its steel slowly oxidizing despite the controlled climate, rust returning it gradually to the earth from which it came. The men who built it are dead. The men who crewed it are dead. The men who destroyed it are mostly dead. Soon, very soon, the last living witnesses to the Pacific War will be gone, and we will enter a new phase of remembrance, where the war exists only in documents and artifacts and second-hand memories. The Hago will probably remain for centuries if we do not destroy ourselves first. Future generations will look at it and wonder what we wondered. How could anyone send men into battle in such a vehicle? What desperation or delusion made it seem acceptable? They will judge us, as we judge those who came before us, and they will likely find us wanting in ways we cannot yet imagine. But perhaps they will also recognize what we sometimes struggle to see, that the men inside the paper tank were human beings like themselves, that they loved and feared and hoped just as we do, that they faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage they could muster. Perhaps they will understand that the Hago represents not just Japan's defeat or American victory, but the human condition itself, our constant struggle against limitations, our refusal to accept defeat even when defeat is inevitable, our capacity to find meaning in struggle even when struggle is futile. The thin steel could not stop bullets, but the men inside it had still climbed aboard, had still driven toward enemy lines, had still tried. That trying, that refusal to surrender to circumstance, that insistence on human agency in the face of overwhelming force, perhaps that is what the Hago actually represents, beyond victory and defeat, beyond triumph and tragedy. The rain that fell on Luzon that January morning in 1945 has long since evaporated, has been recycled through cloud and ocean and earth a million times over. The men who fought there are bones in graves or ashes scattered across the Pacific. The metal of the destroyed tanks has been salvaged and recycled, perhaps incorporated into buildings or automobiles or new weapons for new wars. But the moment remains, preserved in records and memories and artifacts, waiting to teach us whatever lessons we are willing to learn. When U.S. bullets met Japan's paper tank, it was no contest. But the absence of contest does not mean the absence of meaning. Sometimes the meaning is found precisely in the mismatch, in the collision between what is and what should be, in the space between courage and capability, between sacrifice